My name is Jessica Sachs. I work as a staff engineer at Path AI, leading the design system effort for our design system called Anodyne. It means painkiller, which I think is a pretty cool name. We work in med tech, so it's even cooler. I previously led product and engineering for the Cypress component testing team. We shipped Cypress 10 around June, and then I left about a month later, but still loving it, and made the completely agnostic decision to reuse it at my next company. I think that means it was a success for me. I'm a Faker.js maintainer. If everybody remembers January, that was an exciting month for me. And in Jen's talk, she talked about using mock data to develop your components. Huge +1 to that. I work in the Vue, Vite, and Vitest ecosystems. You'll find me around Discord and especially on Twitter. So if you ever want to talk to me, Twitter, don't email me. All right, so I'm going to give a brief introduction to Composables. I'm not going to be going deep into the composition API. I assume that you know what ref and computed do and what watch do. I think those are most of the assumptions. All right, so from the docs. In the context of Vue applications, a composable is a function that leverages Vue's composition API to encapsulate and reuse stateful logic. Basically, it was a solution to replace mixins. It solved all the problems that mixins had. It wasn't very declarative where data was coming from, where methods were coming from, and you would have to write mixins to reuse logic. And that wasn't great. And Anthony Fu, Ant Fu on Twitter and everywhere else, describes Composables setup as the connections between data. And you'll understand what I mean by that around the 6th or 7th composable type. It's a very elegant way of describing it. If you want to hear his actual talk, it's about 20 minutes long. It's called Composable Vue on YouTube. It's a great talk. I rewatched it last night again. So I went over this really quickly. Before Composition API, all we had was mixins. That was not scalable. That was not, how would I say it? It wasn't enough, especially for library authors. But once I learned about the Composition API, I understood at least that it was powerful. This was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And I have had to write mixins before to leverage Vue's reactivity. In the options API, that was the only answer. And this was a major improvement. There was a pretty cool visualization that Evan shared and still lives in the Composition API's FAQ when he made the initial release public of the Composition API RFC. It looked like this, and the colors on the left are your nice little sections. Sorry, there were 2 people here that liked the options API. So on the left, this is how you would have to organize your concerns by color, right? So your data is neatly put at the top, then you have your neat and nice computed and methods right below. And if you sort by concern, you wind up with the Composition API. And on the right, all the colors are neatly put together. So I found this example to be fascinating. It's actually, the component is the Vue CLI file tree explorer is what he used as the example. And it seemed natural to me when I first heard about the Composition API. Cool. And I felt comfortable refactoring most of my reusable component logic into external files, and I began creating composables like you do, with ref and computed and methods and such. But I feel like I was missing something, perhaps a letter after the N. There it is. And after refactoring everything, I didn't know how to further leverage the Composition API. I was like, I think there's something else. I think there's something more. And I like the reactivity paradigm, the way you program with reactivity, and I wanted to see what other patterns it unlocked. Enter VueUse. So VueUse is a collection of essential Vue composition utilities. It has about 250 utilities. Here they scroll by on a 15-second transition. It just keeps going. Okay, so yeah, it's huge and it's massive. And every time I get a new feature request, I go shopping, I call it. I go and I scroll down this massive list and I'm like, okay, what code do I not have to write? Because this library exists and VueUse is not the only composition library. It's huge but a lot of them are actually outsourced. If you see these little external links next to @motion, these are actually separate repositories. But VueUse gives them a shout out, which is very helpful when you're looking for a nice index of all the things that you could have composables for. Cool. So I go shopping, I see what code I don't have to write. Things like use element style. Is my mouse inside of an element? Stuff like that. And I felt inspired because I could then look at the source code and see how does a very mature library compose with composables, and what are the different types. So if we go to the top here, the categories up on the top, let's see how big is it? Relatively big. I think you can see some of the little categories. They were helpful. They helped me think about different types of composables. And they were segmented by responsibility. And that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with my mental model with composables by type. VueUse gave me a starting point, and then I began to think about how would you describe different kinds of composables? Does a composable, necessarily wrap a browser API? Is it Pinia, right? Pinia has composables. Is it VueRouter? VueRouter has composables. Vue-i18n. And then also, there were two interesting ones that were non-obvious to me. I call them connections and reactified functions, and those are coming last. They're the best ones, I think. But first, state. So state was the obvious one for me. We had our component state. So let me back up. I went very quickly through that. So we have state, browser, library integrations, DOM, component, connections, and reactified functions. And we'll go into each one of those right now. State. I have two kinds of state, I think. I have component state, which is created on setup. And this is where you begin to set what your composable connections are, right? You're setting up, I have a ref, and I have a computed, and the computed will watch the different properties of my refs and give me a computed value, all the normal things we do. That's component state. Seems very obvious to me. My first example of component state is going to be something I think everybody has done. It's a Boolean toggle. Let's pretend we have myModal.view. We're going to have a ref. It's going to say is visible. We're going to have a toggle function. Toggle is visible. Seems reasonable. Very simple. Maybe we set a class. We set some classes if it's visible. And there's some methods. I don't want to say boring, but it is kind of boring to me. And the implementation for useToggle, and this was like the first thing I ever wrote, was it takes an option with an initial value, say, initially when you instantiate modal, it should, or my modal, excuse me, it should not display, or it should. You create the ref, and you no longer have to have any of the code on the left side. You can actually just use toggle altogether and delete a lot of the previous code. Did everybody get that? Yeah? All right, yeah, Philip, you got that? Okay. All right, so application state. A little more interesting, right? We have Pinia, and then we have three other libraries that may or may not be known to people. They're not Vue-first libraries, and that's what makes them interesting to me. Because we do have Pinia, and Pinia solves a lot of the problems of Vuex, but we also have the ability to integrate with just about anything, so long as, and I didn't even take my speaker notes out, I have them on my phone. I was all nervous about it. So Pinia is a Vue-first reactivity composable state management library, right? And it does a lot of things that tie into Vue internals. And that's pretty cool, and it can be very performant in Vue applications. I asked Eduardo specifically what it does, and he was like, just skip over it. They don't need to know. He's like, it uses mark raw, and uses deep refs sometimes. Don't talk about it. I was like, all right. So we also have things like Immer. Immer is an immutable state management library. I have never used it in my life. If somebody's used it and I'm saying things wrong, I apologize. But the general idea is that instead of doing deep watching, because a state management library might have their own proxies, like a vanilla state management library might have their own proxies, you just avoid all that and you reset the ref where it says state.value is produce state value with the updater, and a misaligned squiggly. So that's how you would tie Vue's reactivity into just about anything. Let's do it for XState. You can create machines now. You can use machines inside of your components using composables. It's pretty cool. So that was the first type. That was state, right? We have our simple stuff like our refs, our computed, our methods, and then we have our exciting stuff, that big application state. You can do it vanilla and tie into Vue with the composition API, or you can do it using a Vue-first state management library like Pina. Next, we have browser APIs. So this is vanilla. These are wrappers for vanilla browser APIs. It's basically the entire browser category in VueUse, and there are tens of functions, as we saw. We're going to talk about use clipboard first. So some examples of browser composables would be use Bluetooth, use clipboard, and use magic keys. You should look at use magic keys because it has the coolest example of composables I've ever seen. Like, it's a very cool demo page. It's very inspiring. But use Bluetooth would do something like check for permissions. Does your browser even support Bluetooth? Did the user give access to Bluetooth? It does a lot of internals. That's pretty cool. And it's SSR compatible, which is actually kind of hard to do. Use clipboard also does similar things. We're going to use clipboard. So my input.vue might want to have a copy button. So we're going to say, define props, show copy, and we're going to use clipboard and say the source is going to be ref hello. And we'll bind vmodel to the source, and you'll be able to type whatever you want. And if the show copy button should be enabled by checking is supported, which is a ref returned from VueUse's use clipboard composable. If it's supported, meaning if the user has allowed you to use their clipboard, and if the prop says show copy, then you should show the little icon from Carbon of a clipboard, and you should conditionally say copied or copied. Seems pretty simple. And you can imagine there might be many instances, like a code block in a docs example, where you would want to reuse clipboard functionality. And in this one-liner, there's so much going on under the hood. There is checking for if you're in an SSR context, right? That's actually, I don't think many of us would know off the top of our heads how to do it, how to write a client-side safe composable and make sure that is supported would work in many cases. It also supports a legacy mode for IE whatever, or for Firefox. I can't remember which one is flaky, which is, I like it when it's not my problem, to be very concise. So copied also resets after a timeout. So that conditional, that ternary there inside the template, that also has a useTimeout composable inside the internals of clipboard, of use clipboard. So there are like 3 composables inside of use clipboard. And it looks a little bit like this. So we have useTimeout function and useSupported. You use the useSupported composable, check for if the clipboard's a navigator, wrap the source in another ref, just in case it was a maybe ref. Not going to talk about what that is. Watch Anthony's talk that I mentioned earlier. And then it also does this use timeout function to reset copied after a certain time duration. Also very convenient. And the API is very strongly typed by default versus mixins. It was kind of hard to type them. It's another benefit of composables. So next, we have library integrations. Here are 4 examples. One of the most commonly used ones is Axios, but you can also do things like fuzzy search with Vue.js. And if you're ever building a filter list, a file search, file list, or some sort of expandable collapsible tree, having a really, really advanced library backing it that does all the case insensitive stuff is clutch. Super clutch. I had a live demo where I would show how to do the Fuse integration with fuzzy search, but it took too long to do, and I was worried I'd go over time. So next kind of composable, we have DOM composables. In general, I consider a DOM composable to be something that needs to have been called after on mounted, basically. Example would be use dark. So if you're going to toggle between dark and light mode, you at least need to have a DOM there to ask what the preferred mode is. Other examples would be things that need refs. So my favorite example and my first contribution to VueUse was useVirtualList. And there's also a really interactive demo for useDraggable. It allows you to bind a ref to a particular element or slotted component and drag it wherever you want and see the XY coordinates. Really great if you're doing any to-do list first-time projects, because that's what we do. We build little, what are they called? Little boards, little Kanban-style boards or to-do list drag and drops. Yeah. So if you wanted to build something like that as a project, you would use useDraggable, and it would become much simpler than if you had to do it yourself. It also deals with use event listener. So these useVirtualLists, useDraggables, they internally use something called use event listener, which cleans up after itself when the DOM node is removed from the document. All stuff you don't have to think about that we used to have to care about in vanilla JS. Finally, DOM types of composables can perform fairly stable side effects outside of the component hierarchy entirely. There are things like useHead, which manage your head and allow you to write style blocks, add scripts to head, all the fun things, especially meta attributes if you're changing your site's title and you would like better SEO. You can do that with DOM-style composables. Next, we have a pretty advanced type of composable. I would call it the component type composable. Anything that's coupled to the component lifecycle, for example, VueRouter. So the internals of VueRouter need to happen on specific lifecycle hooks of Vue. And also singleton plugins like Vue i18n. Whenever you call create app with your nice little component, your app top-level component, and do .use and do a plugin style installation, sometimes that allows you to set up initial state. And that's how Vue i18n works. You set up your initial locales and such. And then you can call use i18n within any component you want, and it will know where all the locales are, what your default locale is, if you have any fallbacks, etc. The third litmus test I give it is libraries that import get current instance are not able to work outside of a component, right? A lot of reactivity API can work outside of the context of a component, though I wouldn't recommend it. I recommend using composables only within setup functions. You can talk to Daniel on why. I'm not going to explain that. You can also do really interesting things. So a lot of people are going through the Vue 2, Vue 3 migration. Just last week, I wrote something that wasn't hideous. It allows you to override listeners and write backwards compatible components. So this will work in Vue 2 and Vue 3. Anodyne, as I mentioned, is a backwards compatible library. It cross-compiles to Vue 3 and Vue 2.7 using the same source code. And this is a shim that I put together. And it's extremely hacky. And when I said advanced, I meant advanced as in you should be prepared for it to break. But it works. And so you can do things like getting the proxy from the current instance if you're within a component setup lifecycle, and then grab listeners, filter your adders if you're in Vue 3 for the things that start with on. And this is to spec. This is not, at least right now it's to spec, right? So this works, and it's to spec. And I had Thorsten tell me it was okay. I was like, how terrible is this in Discord? And he was like, seems all right. I would do it. And so those are the kinds of component composables that I would consider, stuff that needs lifecycle events. Finally, connections. And connections were an aha moment for me. I consider connections to be shorthand for writing declarative APIs for computed properties and watch. So a lot of times in computed properties and watch, we have our dependencies, what we're going to watch, and then a lambda, right? Anonymous function on what we want to do when things change. And then in computeds, we're oftentimes checking the truthiness, if something's still loading, etc. And VueUse itself gives you some shorthands. it has whenever, it has until, array filter methods, array map methods, logical not, logical and, etc. It's a huge section of the VueUse API. And when I first saw this giant list of functions, I was like, somebody got a little excited with the composition API. I was like, when would you use these things? And every time I came back to the documentation site, I was like, who uses this? Why would you use this? And eventually it hit me that it was shorthand. And it's actually fairly declarative. So here's an example of fetching from a small dog URL. This is a fake URL I came up with like 40 minutes ago. A dog image, and you use logical and to say const load is equal to image ready and has dog breed data. And what you don't see is me unpacking value, because logical and does that for me. And so you can change that to be a ref, a maybe ref, it doesn't matter. And that's pretty exciting because you're computed, instead of saying right above it, image ready.value, has dog breed data.value, you can write a much shorter line of code. It also doesn't use async await, so you don't have to wrap it in suspense. Pretty nice. And it allows you to make your utilities synchronous instead of async. These are the connections that you're trying to build. Finally, we have the last one, which is reactified functions. So these are normal functions that now are able to be cross-compatible with things like array map, Lodash. You can reactify just about anything. And you should check out the VueChemistry repository. Here's the example of array map. Instead of having to worry about value, instead of having to worry about if an item is a ref, you no longer have to do that. You just grab the result, and it's a computed, and it automatically updates with list if any of your items change. So those are the 7 types of reactified functions that I have. Here's a list of the array ones in VueUse. Go check out VueUse. Thank you for your time. Have a great conference.